What if everyone suddenly started living to 200 years old? How would society change? And could our planet even handle it? Buckle up, because we're about to explore a future that would turn everything we know about human civilization completely upside down. Imagine blowing out 200 candles on your birthday cake. Sounds pretty amazing, right? But here's the thing. Doubling the human lifespan wouldn't just mean more birthdays. It would fundamentally reshape every aspect of our world in ways that might shock you. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The idea of living to 200 isn't actually science fiction anymore. Right now, researchers are using something called CRISPR gene editing to tinker with the very code of life itself. They've already managed to extend the lifespan of yeast cells by 82% just by rewiring their genetic circuits. And here's where it gets really interesting. Scientists are currently testing drugs like metformin and rapamycin that could slow down the aging process in humans. But before we get carried away dreaming about our bicentennial birthdays, we need to talk about what this would actually mean for our planet. Because here's the reality check. Nobody wants to hear, if everyone lived to 200, we'd be looking at a population explosion that would make our current environmental challenges look like a walk in the park. Think about it this way. Right now, the average person lives about 72 years globally. If we suddenly tripled that lifespan, we wouldn't just have more people around longer, we'd have multiple generations all consuming resources at the same time. Your great-great-great-grandchildren could literally meet their great-great-great-grandparents. Sounds heartwarming until you realize they'd all need food, water, energy, and somewhere to live. The environmental math is pretty brutal. Every person living to 200 would consume resources for nearly 3 times longer than they do now. We're talking about the same individual eating meals, using electricity, and producing waste for an extra 128 years. Multiply that by billions of people, and you've got a sustainability nightmare. Current deforestation rates are already alarming. We lose about 4 million hectares of forest every year in sub-Saharan Africa alone. With 200-year lifespans, that pressure would intensify exponentially. We'd need more farmland to feed everyone, more space for housing, and more resources for energy production. But the environmental impact is just the beginning. Let's talk about what this would do to the economy, because things get really weird really fast. Imagine trying to plan for retirement when you might live for 2 centuries. The traditional model of work for 40 years and retire for 20 would completely collapse. Instead, you'd probably need to think about having multiple careers throughout your extended lifetime. Maybe you start as a teacher for your first 50 years, then become an engineer for the next 50, followed by a stint as an artist, and finally ending up as a philosopher in your twilight years between ages 150 and 200. The financial implications are staggering. Pension systems that are already struggling to support people for 20 or 30 years of retirement would need to handle potentially 100 years or more. Insurance companies would have to completely recalculate their risk models. And here's a mind bender. Compound interest would work very differently when you have 200 years to let your investments grow. Social security systems around the world would face unprecedented pressure. According to current projections, the longevity economy, just people over 50, already contributes about $45 trillion to global GDP. Now imagine that same demographic potentially living for another 150 years. But here's where things get really fascinating and a little disturbing. The social dynamics of 200-year lifespans would create relationship patterns that have never existed in human history. Picture this. You could potentially be married to the same person for 170 years. That's longer than most countries have existed. Divorce rates might skyrocket. Or maybe we'd develop entirely new models of relationships, perhaps contracts that renew every 50 years. And what about your career? The concept of seniority would become absolutely meaningless when someone could have 180 years of work experience. Imagine being the new guy at the office when your boss has been doing the same job since before your great-grandparents were born. The knowledge gap between generations would be enormous, yet those generations would all be working side by side. Universities would face an identity crisis. Why get a degree at 22 when you have 178 years left to live? People might collect dozens of degrees throughout their extended lifetimes. Medical school at 50, law school at 100, maybe pick up an art degree at 150 just for fun. The entire education system would need to be completely reimagined. Housing markets would go absolutely bonkers. If people are living in the same homes for potentially 150 years, when would houses ever come back on the market? Young people might never be able to afford homes because the older generations, who remember when those houses cost a fraction of current prices, would never sell. We'd probably see the rise of temporary housing designed for 30 or 40-year leases. The psychological effects might be the strangest part of all. Human brains aren't wired to plan for 2 centuries of life. We already struggle with long-term thinking for retirement planning over just a few decades. How would you maintain motivation and purpose across 200 years? Would people become incredibly wise with all that experience? Or would they become paralyzed by having too much time to overthink every decision? Mental health systems would face challenges we can't even imagine. Grief would take on new dimensions when you might outlive not just your parents, but potentially your children and grandchildren. The phrase "till death do us part" would carry a completely different weight when death might be 150 years away. Crime and justice systems would need complete overhauls too. What's an appropriate sentence for someone who has 170 years left to live? A 25-year prison sentence suddenly seems like a weekend getaway rather than a significant portion of someone's life. And here's something nobody talks about. What happens to innovation and social progress when the people in power have potentially been making decisions for over a century? Would society become more stable because of all that accumulated wisdom? Or would it stagnate because change happens so slowly when everyone has forever to think about it? The dating scene alone would be absolutely wild. Imagine online dating profiles where people list their age as 127 and mention they're looking for someone to spend their next 50 years with before potentially moving on to explore other relationships. The phrase starter marriage would take on a whole new meaning. But perhaps the most mind-bending aspect is this. If everyone lived to 200, the very concept of time would feel different. Decades would feel like what years feel like now. People might casually say things like, "Oh, I'll get around to learning piano in my 142nd," or "I'm thinking about having kids again when I turn 180. So, Maya, to answer your question, could our planet handle everyone living to 200 years old? The short answer is probably not, without some pretty dramatic changes to how we do basically everything. We're talking about reimagining work, relationships, education, housing, healthcare, and even our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. The technology to extend lifespans might be within reach, but the infrastructure to support a world of bicentenarians definitely isn't STES. We'd need to solve sustainability challenges that make today's environmental problems look simple, redesign economic systems from the ground up, and figure out how to keep people mentally healthy across 2 centuries of existence. But here's the thing, maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Sure, the challenges would be enormous, but think about what humanity could accomplish with 200 years of accumulated wisdom and experience. We might finally solve problems that have plagued us for millennia, simply because we'd have the time to really think them through. The real question isn't whether we could handle everyone living to 200, it's whether we'd want to. Because as we've seen, longer doesn't always mean better, and sometimes the most profound changes come with consequences we never saw coming. What do you think? Would you want to live to 200 if it meant completely transforming human civilization as we know it?